Throughout human history, we've used bells to mark important moments. Church bells for worship, school bells for learning, warning bells for danger. But in the deep mountains of Virginia's Appalachian Range, there's a bell that serves a different purpose. A bell that hasn't been rung by human hands in over a century, but still sounds on certain nights when the moon is dark and the forest grows unnaturally quiet. The locals know what the night bell means. They lock their doors, close their shutters, and pray they're far enough from the old church ruins to be safe. Because when the night bell rings, something wakes up. Something that's been fed by ritual and sacrifice for longer than anyone can remember. And everything in the forest, predator and prey alike, knows what the bell means. Dinner is served. This is the story of Jake Hendricks, who heard the night bell and thought he was investigating a mystery. He had no idea he was being invited to a feast as the main course. Welcome to the hunting grounds. The bell is about to ring. Jake Hendricks had built a successful true crime podcast called Dark Hollow by investigating strange deaths and disappearances in rural America. His niche was cases that mainstream media ignored: missing people in isolated areas, suspicious deaths ruled as accidents, old cold cases from small towns that didn't have the resources to investigate properly. Jake would spend weeks researching, conducting interviews, and sometimes visiting the locations where the incidents occurred. His latest project had brought him to Southwest Virginia, where he was investigating a cluster of disappearances dating back to the 1890s. 17 people had vanished from the small town of Ashford over a span of 30 years, all during the autumn months, all within a 5-mile radius of an abandoned church in the mountains. The disappearances had stopped in 1897, the same year the church had been abandoned. Local records said the congregation had simply dispersed, but Jake had found hints of something darker, references to the old rituals and the harvest night in personal letters and diaries from that period. Jake arrived in modern-day Ashford, population 89, on a gray October afternoon. The town consisted of a post office, a general store, and maybe 20 houses scattered along a narrow valley. The mountain ridges rose steeply on both sides, creating a claustrophobic feeling of being trapped at the bottom of a bowl. At the general store, Jake asked about the old church and the disappearances. The elderly clerk, a man with deep-set eyes and weathered skin, studied Jake for a long moment before responding. "You're here about the night bell?" the man said. "I'm researching historical disappearances in the area. I didn't know there was a bell involved." "There's always been a bell. Iron bell, cast in 1823, hung in the church tower, supposed to call folks to worship." The clerk's expression was grim. "But it got used for other purposes. The old pastor, Reverend Elias Blackwood, he discovered something in these mountains, something ancient, started conducting rituals, changing the services. By the end, what they were doing in that church had nothing to do with Christianity." "What kind of rituals?" "The kind that feed things that should starve, the kind that keep old bargains alive. Blackwood found something in the deep woods, a place where the barrier between our world and something else is thin. He thought he could control it, use it. The bell was part of his ritual. When it rang at midnight, it was a signal, an invitation." "An invitation to what?" "To the hunt. Whatever Blackwood made his bargain with, it hunts on certain nights. The bell rings to announce the hunt has begun, to call the prey to the proper place." The clerk leaned forward. "You're planning to go up to that old church?" "I was thinking about it, for the podcast." "Don't, and especially don't go at night. The church is ruins now, burned in 1897 when the townspeople finally had enough of Blackwood's practices. But the bell survived, hangs there in the ruined tower still, and sometimes, on dark moon nights in October, it rings. We hear it all the way down here in the valley. When we hear it, we stay inside, lock the doors, wait for morning." "Has anyone disappeared recently?" Jake asked. "Not since '97. We learned our lesson. We stay away from the ruins, especially at night, and we teach our children to do the same." The clerk's expression darkened. "But every few years, someone from outside comes. A hiker, a curiosity seeker, someone who doesn't know the rules. Sometimes they come back. Usually they don't. You want my advice? Do your research from here in town. Talk to the old-timers who remember the stories, but don't go up to that church, and if you hear a bell ringing at midnight, run the other direction." Jake thanked him for the warning, but had no intention of following it. This was exactly the kind of local folklore that made for great podcast content. He'd camp near the church ruins, record some ambient audio, and maybe catch some ambient sound that locals interpreted as a bell ringing. With proper context and narration, it would make a compelling episode. The hike to the church took 3 hours, following an overgrown trail that clearly saw little use. Jake reached the ruins just before sunset and immediately understood why this place had captured the local imagination. The church sat in a small clearing surrounded by ancient trees. Most of the structure had collapsed, only portions of the stone walls remained, along with the tower, which stood at about 40 feet tall, despite missing its roof. And hanging in the open tower, suspended by a rusted chain, was the bell. It was larger than Jake expected, at least 4 feet tall, made of dark iron that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Even from the ground, he could see strange symbols carved on its surface, patterns that didn't match any religious iconography he recognized. Jake set up his tent at the edge of the clearing and spent the remaining daylight exploring and recording. He documented the ruins, collected ambient forest sounds, and recorded his observations for the podcast. The place had an undeniably eerie atmosphere, but Jake attributed that to its isolation and the local stories coloring his perception. As darkness fell, the forest around the clearing grew quiet. Jake noticed the same phenomenon he had experienced in other remote locations, the absence of normal nighttime sounds. No insects, no owls, no rustling of nocturnal animals, just oppressive silence. Jake made dinner on his camp stove and reviewed his recordings. Good material. He'd return to town tomorrow, conduct more interviews, piece together the full story of Reverend Blackwood and whatever rituals he'd conducted here. At 11:47 p.m., Jake was in his tent preparing for sleep when he heard something that made his blood run cold. Footsteps. Multiple sets of footsteps moving through the forest around the clearing. Not the casual walking of hikers, but deliberate, measured steps, as if whoever was out there was taking up positions. Jake grabbed his flashlight and unzipped his tent. He swept the beam across the clearing and into the forest beyond. Nothing. No movement, no figures. But the footsteps continued, now coming from a different direction, circling the clearing. "Hello?" Jake called out. "Is someone there?" The footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was absolute. No echo of his voice, no ambient sound, nothing. Jake stood frozen, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, showing him empty forest. Then, at exactly midnight, the bell rang. The sound was massive, overwhelming, physically painful in its intensity. Jake dropped his flashlight and covered his ears, but the ringing seemed to come from inside his skull as much as from the tower. The bell tolled once, twice, 3 times, each peal reverberating through the clearing and into the forest beyond. And the forest answered. From every direction came sounds, howls, shrieks, roars that belonged to no animal Jake could identify. The ground beneath his feet trembled, the trees swayed, though there was no wind. And from the darkness at the edge of the clearing, shapes began to emerge. They looked like animals at first, deer, bear, wolves, all moving into the clearing in response to the bell. But as they entered the moonlight, Jake saw they were wrong, distorted. The deer's antlers were too large, too many-branched, spreading like coral. The bear's mouth was too wide, filled with too many teeth. The wolves moved on legs that bent at wrong angles. And behind them came other things. shapes that never been animals, things that walked upright but had too many limbs, faces that were almost human but fundamentally wrong, bodies that seemed to shift and change as they moved from shadow to light. All of them were converging on the clearing, on Jake. He scrambled back into his tent and grabbed his phone. No signal, he'd expected that, but he had a satellite emergency beacon in his pack. Jake fumbled for it, hands shaking, and activated the distress signal. Outside, the creatures circled the tent. Jake could hear them breathing, wet, labored sounds that spoke of anatomy not designed for air. Could smell them, a mix of rot and sulfur and something else, something organic but fundamentally wrong. Then one of them spoke. "The bell has rung. The prey has been marked. The hunt begins." Jake heard fabric tearing, claws or teeth cutting through his tent. Jake grabbed his camping knife, useless against what was out there, but it was all he had, and prepared to fight. The tent collapsed around him as something massive tore it from its stakes. Jake found himself lying on the ground, surrounded by creatures that his mind struggled to process. In the moonlight, they were horrible, amalgamations of animal and something else, things that looked like they'd been assembled from parts that didn't belong together. The largest one, the thing that might have been a bear once, leaned down. Its breath was hot and rancid. "Run. The bell demands the ritual. You must run. Make it sporting. Make it worthy." Jake didn't need to be told twice. He bolted for the trail, his flashlight forgotten, running blind through the forest. Behind him, he heard the creatures howling, not in pursuit yet, but in anticipation. They were giving him a head start, making it sporting. Jake crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping at his face. His lungs burned, his legs screamed, but terror drove him forward, down the mountain, toward the valley, and safety. He'd made it maybe a quarter mile when he heard them coming, not running, but moving through the forest with terrifying efficiency. These things knew this terrain, had hunted here before. Were hurting him, Jake realized, blocking certain paths, forcing him in a specific direction. They weren't just hunting him, they were driving him somewhere, towards something. Jake broke through the trees into another clearing, smaller than the first. In the center was a stone altar, ancient and weathered, with channels carved into its surface that led to a depression at the center. The channels were stained dark, and Jake knew with sick certainty what had run through them. Blood. Centuries of blood. The creatures emerged from the forest, forming a circle around the clearing. Jake spun, looking for an escape route, but they'd positioned themselves to block every exit. He was trapped. The bear thing stepped forward, and when it spoke, Jake realized it wasn't speaking English. It was speaking something older, a language of growls and clicks that somehow Jake understood, as if the meaning was being transmitted directly into his mind. "The bell calls. The old pact must be honored. A life given freely in the place of feeding. The barrier grows thin. The hungry ones must be satisfied." "I didn't give anything freely," Jake gasped. "I didn't agree to any pact." "You came when the bell rang. You heard the call and remained in the hunting ground. By the old rules, that is consent enough." Other shapes were moving in the darkness beyond the circle of creatures, larger shapes, things that weren't even pretending to be animals anymore. Jake caught glimpses of them, towering forms with too many eyes, appendages that moved wrong, geometries that hurt to look at directly. These were what Reverend Blackwood had made his bargain with. These were the hungry ones. And the deformed creatures around the clearing weren't hunters. They were servants, worshippers, things that had been animals once, but had been changed by proximity to these entities, transformed into cult servants of something from outside. "The early settlers understood," the Reverend continued. Humanity was encroaching. The old places were shrinking. Soon there would be nowhere for the hungry ones to feed, nowhere for the boundaries to remain thin. So he made a bargain. He would ring the bell, would mark prey, would ensure the hungry ones were fed. In exchange, they would spare his town, would take only what was offered. "For how long?" Jake asked, though he was afraid he knew the answer. "Forever, as long as the bell remains, as long as the church stands in some form, as long as there are those who remember the ritual." The creature's lips pulled back, revealing far too many teeth. The Reverend's congregation learned the truth too late. They tried to end it, burned the church, fled the valley, but the bell cannot be destroyed by ordinary fire, and the pact remains. Every dark moon in October, the bell rings, and those who hear it and do not flee become the offering. The larger shapes were closer now, and Jake could feel them, not just see them, but feel their presence like pressure against his mind. They were hungry, ancient, and utterly alien. They existed in spaces between moments, in angles that shouldn't exist, in hungers that had no name in human language. And they wanted him. Jake looked at the altar, at the dark stains, at the channels designed to catch blood. This was how Reverend Blackwood had kept his bargain: monthly sacrifices, people lured or forced to the hunting ground when the bell rang, fed to things that should never have been awakened. "You have two choices. Go to the altar willingly, die quickly. Your death will honor the pact, will satisfy the hungry ones, will allow them to return to their slumber for another moon. Or run, and we will hunt you, chase you, make your death last hours. Either way, the pact will be fulfilled." Jake looked at the ring of creatures, at the massive shadows beyond them, at the altar waiting for him. And he made a choice that he knew was probably futile, but was the only option he had left. He charged directly at the weakest point in the circle, a gap between two of the smaller wolf things, and somehow burst through. The creatures howled in surprise and rage. Jake didn't look back. He ran into the forest, no longer trying to follow trails, just trying to put distance between himself and the clearing. The hunt began in earnest. The creatures pursued him now with no restraint, no sporting delay. He could hear them crashing through the undergrowth behind him, could hear their excited howls, could feel the ground trembling under their pursuit. He had no chance of outrunning them. They would catch him eventually. But Jake refused to die on that altar, refused to willingly participate in some century-old pact he had no part in making. If he was going to die, and he almost certainly was, he'd make them work for it. Jake ran for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. His legs gave out, and he fell hard, tumbling down a slope and landing in a shallow stream. The cold water shocked his system, giving him a brief surge of clarity. Upstream, maybe 50 yards away, Jake saw lights, electric lights, a cabin. He scrambled to his feet and ran towards it, every muscle screaming. Behind him, the howls grew closer. The creatures had his scent, had him cornered between their pursuit and the stream. Jake reached the cabin and pounded on the door. "Help! Please! Something's chasing me!" The door opened to reveal the clerk from the general store. The old man took one look at Jake's wild-eyed expression, heard the howls from the forest, and pulled him inside, slamming and bolting the door. "You were at the church," the clerk said. It wasn't a question. Jake nodded, gasping for breath. "You heard the bell." "Yes, and then things came. Creatures. They tried to make me there was an altar." "I know about the altar." The clerk moved to the windows, checking that the heavy shutters were secured. "My grandfather was part of Blackwood's congregation. He told me everything before he died. The bell, the pact, the hungry ones. Most folks in Ashford know bits and pieces. We stay away from the ruins on dark moon nights. But you outsiders, you don't know. You don't listen to the warnings." "I'm sorry, I didn't believe." "Of course you didn't. Nobody does until they hear that bell." The clerk sighed. "You're safe here for now. The cabin sits on consecrated ground. My grandfather made sure of that before he died, drew symbols of protection, performed counter-rituals. The hungry ones and their servants can't enter, but they'll wait out there until dawn. They always do." Jake went to a shuttered window and peered through a crack. Outside in the darkness, he could see shapes moving, dozens of them, circling the cabin, waiting. "What happens at dawn?" Jake asked. "They return to the deep places, go dormant. The pact only has power during the dark hours. Come daylight, you can leave safely." Jake slumped against the wall, the adrenaline finally draining from his system. He was alive. By pure luck, he'd stumbled onto the one safe place in these mountains. He'd survived the night bell. "Why do you live up here?" Jake asked. "Why stay so close to that?" The clerk was quiet for a long moment. Then he rolled up his sleeve, showing Jake his forearm. In the dim lamplight, Jake could see scars, old scars, forming a pattern. Symbols like the ones carved into the bell. "I told you my grandfather was part of Blackwood's congregation. What I didn't tell you is that he participated in the rituals, helped ring the bell, helped prepare the offerings. By the time he understood what they were really doing, he was already marked. The pact had claimed him. He couldn't leave these mountains. Tried once and nearly died. The hungry ones had their hooks in him. And you? I was born into it. Third generation marked by the pact. I can't leave the valley either. None of us can, the few families who descended from Blackwood's congregation. We're bound here, caretakers of a bargain we never made. We keep people away when we can, we honor the warnings, and on dark moon nights in October, we hide and pray the hungry ones are satisfied with whatever prey wanders into their hunting ground when the bell calls." Jake felt sick. These people were prisoners, trapped by their ancestors' actions, forced to live in the shadow of something terrible, and now, because of his foolishness, he'd nearly become another sacrifice to keep the old pact alive. The night passed with agonizing slowness. Jake dozed fitfully, jerking awake at every sound from outside. The creatures circled all night, occasionally scratching at the walls or testing the door, but they couldn't enter. When dawn finally came, Jake looked through the window crack and saw the creatures retreating. They moved back toward the mountains, their forms seeming to blur and fade in the morning light, as if they only had solid substance in darkness. The clerk made coffee and eggs. They ate in silence. Finally, the old man spoke. "You'll leave today. Drive away from Ashford and never come back, and you won't speak of this, won't make your podcast about it. Because if you do, others will come. Curiosity seekers, thrill hunters, people who think they can handle it, and the hungry ones will feast." "People should know," Jake said. "They should know to stay away." "They already know to stay away. We tell them. But there's always someone who doesn't listen, who thinks the warnings are just stories." The clerk's expression was hard. "If you publicize this, you'll kill people. Is your podcast worth that?" Jake thought about the altar, the channels for blood, the creatures that served things from outside. He thought about the clerk and the other descendants, trapped here by a bargain made generations ago. And now he thought about what would happen if his podcast sent hundreds of curious listeners to these mountains. "No," he said quietly, "it's not worth it." Jake left Ashford that morning and drove straight through to Richmond. He deleted all his recordings from the ruins, all his notes about the disappearances. He scrapped the entire investigation. His podcast audience was disappointed when he announced he was abandoning the Virginia project and moving on to a different case. Some accused him of censoring himself, of hiding something, but Jake never explained, never talked about what he'd experienced in the mountains. Because some stories aren't meant to be told. Some warnings exist for good reason, and some bargains, once made, can never be broken, only honored, over and over, sacrifice after sacrifice, until the end of time. The night bell still hangs in the ruins of Reverend Blackwood's church, and on dark moon nights in October, it still rings. The people of Ashford lock their doors and wait for dawn, and the hungry ones feed on whatever prey is foolish enough to ignore the warnings and enter the hunting ground when the bell calls. The pact remains, the ritual continues, and the bell will ring again. Jake Hendricks still produces his podcast, but he's never returned to Virginia. He won't even drive through the state if he can avoid it. Sometimes, on dark nights in October, he wakes at midnight feeling a pull, a compulsion to drive south, to return to those mountains, to see if the bell still rings. He fights the compulsion, but it never fully goes away. The clerk was wrong about one thing. Jake wasn't completely unmarked by his experience. Something in him changed that night. Some connection was made when he heard the night bell and ran through the hunting ground. He's not bound to the valley like the descendants of Blackwood's congregation, but he's not entirely free either. The hungry ones remember him, the prey that got away. And they're patient. The church ruins are still there, deep in the Virginia mountains. The bell still hangs in the tower, waiting. And every dark moon in October, it rings at midnight, calling the hunt to begin. The people of Ashford have learned to live with it, to avoid the hunting ground, to pay the terrible price of their ancestors' bargain. But outsiders still come. Hikers who don't know the warnings, thrill seekers who think they're brave, people who hear the stories and dismiss them as folklore. The bell rings for them, and the hungry ones are always, always fed. How many rituals like this exist in remote places around the world? How many old bargains are still being honored, still demanding sacrifice? How many warnings do we ignore because we think we're too smart, too modern, too rational to believe in such things? The night bell is waiting, the pact is eternal, and the hunting ground is always open for those foolish enough to enter when the bell calls. If this story has you checking your calendar for dark moons, hit that subscribe button for more terrifying tales from America's oldest and darkest traditions. And remember, when locals tell you to stay away from a place, when they warn you not to go somewhere at night, when they speak of old rules and ancient bargains, listen, because some warnings aren't superstition. Some are survival instructions for living near things that predate human civilization. Some bells aren't meant to call you to worship. They're meant to call you to slaughter. And if you ever hear a bell ringing at midnight in the deep woods, run. Don't investigate. Don't record it. Don't try to understand it. Just run. And pray you're fast enough to escape the hunting ground before the hungry ones notice you're there.